Her mother tells her that it's finally time to remove, I think the words she uses are the old man smell from their house.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corene from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional, the book lovers podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. My name is Sadie, and I'll be your host today. And for this episode, I am joined by just one book friend, Corene. How are you, Corene?
I am good. I feel like, ironically, I am the only other person here. And considering the topic, I feel like a bit like of an imposter.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, am I the only one of our group who is British Columbian born and raised?
Of our current group, I think you are. I think Liz, but Liz is our part-time, sometimes book friend, our on and off book friend, if you will. And yeah, I think of our current roster, you are the only one who is British Columbian born and raised.
So a bit of a hint into what our topic is going to be today. I think that in Port Moody here, we have a constant reminder of the beautiful place that we live. We just have to look out the doors, look out the windows, and see beautiful British Columbia all around us. So as you have probably guessed, today we are going to be reading books that are about or set in or authors are from or a combination of all three in British Columbia. And yes, as Corene said, you are not originally from BC, but you have been here. How many years have you been in BC now, Corene?
A number of years. A number of years. So I went here for school and then I moved back to Alberta to work for a little while. And then I came back to British Columbia again, mostly because I truly hate winter. Actually, let me be more specific. I hate shoveling snow.
That is, I get that. I definitely get that. I think that we are both BC people now. I think that we can claim that. Maybe.
I mean, according to the taxes that I'm paying, yes, I am a resident of British Columbia.
There you go. According to the government. And doesn't that count for a lot? Anyway, so yes, today we're going to be talking all about books about British Columbia, set in British Columbia. And I think that we're going to be getting two very different stories today. We're going to start with Corene. And Corene, what book about BC did you pick?
Yeah. So when thinking of BC authors, we're very much spoiled for choice. We have so many fantastic BC authors. As I pulled up Google frantically last night to figure that out, who I was going to talk about. Yeah, many of which are going to be at the Tri-Cities Writers Fest that is coming up at the end of May. So there's lots of fantastic authors there. You can pick up one of the brochures or check the website for the roster of authors there. Weirdly enough, when I actually digged into it, I realized that this author is Australian, but moved to BC and has lived there for a long time and has actually spoken at this library before. She's made essentially a career of writing about BC, delving into BC history, getting all those kind of hidden diamonds or gems of BC history and kind of bringing them to the light. So when I thought of a BC author that I kind of wanted to talk about, I wanted to choose someone who's really kind of done a lot in their career to kind of talk about the history of BC and all of those hidden stories. And because it's me and I'm working off of my bingo card, I also wanted crime. So I managed to easily find someone who fits both of those bills. What I think is interesting, Sadie, is that I believe we both chose Vancouver authors. Very specifically, even though there's a lot more to BC than Vancouver, even though we are a little biased in this podcast today because there's only two of us, we did choose two kind of Vancouver-based authors. So my author that I chose has a wealth of books to choose from, including a new one coming out soon, or that is just out, which is Beneath Dark Waters, The Legacy of the Empress of Ireland Shipwreck. So if you're into a good shipwreck story, she's got a book for you. But she also has lots of books about the hidden history of Victoria, the hidden history of Vancouver, as well as her plethora of crime or mysteries or unsolved mystery books, I am, of course, talking about the Vancouver author, Eve Lazarus. So, two of my favorite books by Eve Lazarus, Murder by Milkshake and Cold Case Vancouver. Cold Case Vancouver was a BC Book Prize honor book, and this is all about the city's most baffling unsolved mysteries, which I really enjoyed. And in fact, I was listening to one of my Mandarin crime podcasts, and they had referenced this book, and I just about stopped dead in the middle of the SkyTrain. Like, that's how far the reach is when they were talking about the Renfrew murders. And I was like, I lived in Renfrew, and they're talking about Vancouver. So Eve Lazarus's kind of reach is very long. She has a wonderful blog where she does different interviews. She has a podcast that she runs about kind of like Vancouver-based mysteries or true crime. And I wanted to talk about probably, I would argue, maybe one of like her most famous ones, and one where she delves into just one case. And I would say this is perhaps one of British Columbia's most famous true crime cases. In fact, this is one that I had kind of even heard about before I read about. Whenever I looked at like a white spot milkshake, I had a strange sense of disquiet and I couldn't figure out why. And then this book came out and I was like, oh, it has so kind of like permeated into the lore of British Columbia that it really is a kind of like a part of the culture, whether we know it or not. And so, again, this is The Murder by Milkshake, an astonishing true story of adultery, arsenic, and a charismatic killer. So the story centers around Esther Castellani, who was sick in hospital, and the doctors couldn't figure out why. She had a lot of symptoms. Her stomach was upset. She was weak. She had a weak heart. But what was more baffling to them is that she would come into the hospital, she would start to get a little bit better. It seemed like the treatments were working, and then all of a sudden she would take a turn for the worse. This continued as a pattern until, unfortunately, she passed away in 1965. Now, Esther was married to a popular CKNW radio personality, and that used to be a job. Just being a personality. But I get it. Like, when I grew up in my small town, I knew the names of all the radio broadcasters like they were celebrities. And so if you think about Vancouver as like a very like small city at that point, you could be a very popular radio personality. And her husband's name was Renee. And she's got the pronunciation in there, and I double checked it in the book before going here. And so he was this very, very charismatic man. He was very popular. He liked to do a lot of stunts, including he kind of camped out on the CKNW sign for a while for kind of like publicity. He was very popular around the office. Everyone just kind of like was drawn to him. He was funny and boisterous and wonderful. And everyone just kind of really appreciated how much he loved his wife, Esther, and kind of how devoted he was to her. Now, the couple had a young daughter who at the time of Esther's death was 11 years old. This is Jeannie. And she was absolutely kind of rocked by her mother's death, but more so by what followed. Now, one of the heroes in this particular book, the doctor who wouldn't let the matter drop. The doctors just felt that there was something about this particular medical case that didn't seem right. They couldn't pinpoint a cause of death, whether medical or whether she had some sort of underlying condition. And so they continued to investigate even when there were no signs pointing to. It was a mystery that niggled at them. Something about it did not seem right. And this was probably a lot easier to figure out when shortly after her death, Renee took the daughter, his young, hot girlfriend, and the girlfriend's son to Disneyland, because that's not a good look. I realize that everyone processes grief differently, and that's fine. But shortly after your wife's horrible, tragic death, you probably shouldn't take the girlfriend to Disneyland. People are going to talk. People are going to ask questions. And they did. They really did. So it turns out Renee was having an affair with the young receptionist at the radio station. And shortly after this, all of the story starts to unravel. And it is a very interesting examination of kind of like Vancouver in the 60s, which I really enjoyed, is that she brings all of that particular context to it, both what the police are doing, what medical life is like, what Vancouver is like at the time, the attitudes of the people in Vancouver towards this particular case, how true crime is. And then what I also really appreciate about Eve Lazarus is that by training, she's an investigative journalist. And so she spends a lot of time looking at the impact that it had on Jeannie Castellani, as well as Lolly's son. She does a lot of interviews about the case, going through, talking to people. And she really talks about not just kind of like the sensational case itself, as it was. It was a huge case in Vancouver, but kind of like the social and legal realities of what happens after something like that. We tend to get kind of, in all true crime documentaries, the solving of it, this slow gathering of clues, and then eventually the big reveal of the legal case. And then the story's over. But of course, for the victims of a crime like this and the perpetrators, their lives go on. And I think that's what makes Eve Lazarus really stand out, is that it's not just the legal case itself. She kind of shows that impact throughout people's lives of how this case and this decision by this man really impacted the people around him, as well as how he continued to live his life. So I really enjoyed this story. I think that Eve Lazarus does a fantastic job of really getting into what Vancouver was like at this time, the psychology and personality of someone that would do such a thing and then go to Disneyland with the girlfriend, absolutely considering that they would never be caught, as well as like looking at the ramifications that it had on Jeannie as well as Lolly's son, Don, and looking at how that has impacted them up until today. So if you are a fan of true crime and want to learn a little bit more about kind of the history of Vancouver in our own backyard, I would absolutely recommend picking up Eve Lazarus's books, either Murder by Milkshake, which I thought was wonderful. You're into something that is a little bit shorter, if you just want kind of like little stories. I really thought Cold Case Vancouver, the city's most baffling unsolved murders, was also really exceptional. It was very strange kind of reading through this book and recognizing that I knew some of these houses. I had definitely walked these streets all the time. I knew those railroad tracks. Like, I kind of putting a little bit more story and context to the place that we live in, and kind of all of those unsolved cases that hopefully at some time will see the light of the day and their perpetrators will be punished, as well as the families that kind of have this other layer of history that we don't always see in Vancouver. We don't always know these stories. So yeah, my BC author is Eve Lazarus.
Wonderful. So I've always wondered, I remember reading that book a few years ago and finding it fascinating as well. And so my grandpa worked in radio in like the 50s, more the 50s, but like the early 60s. Well, I think he passed away kind of mid 60s. And I've always wondered if he knew them in some way or like had some connection. Of course, he is not here. And my mom was a child at that point, so I don't think she would know, but maybe she would know the names. And yeah, so I've always wondered if my family has knew them in any way. Cause that's what's so interesting about a local thing like that, where, so like I said, like my mom's family has been here at least my grandma's generation. So like my mom grew up here. And so there's connections that maybe, I don't know though. All right. So for my book, I am taking a little bit of a different take. So as Corene mentioned, also a Vancouver-based author. And strangely enough, so I think, Corene, you said Eve Lazarus, and I know Eve Lazarus has spoken here, but I think that you had said that this author has also had a connection to the Port Moody Public Library. This was before my time. So I did not know that when I picked up this book. But the book that I have chosen for today, and the author is Jen Sookfong Lee. The book is called The End of East, and this is the first of her books that I have read. She is a CBC radio personality, you might say. I think they probably just call them hosts now, though. But so yeah, she's a CBC host. And she has a handful of books as well. I believe that this was her first novel. It's the only one that I have read of hers. And as I said, it takes a bit of a different spin to BC, but also is a bit of a historical story. But we start in the present day. And we start with Sammy. And Sammy Chan was sure that she had escaped all of her family obligations when she moved to Montreal for school. She's the youngest of 5 sisters, and each one of them has kind of been in charge of caring for their mother at some point in their lives. But Sammy thought that she escaped all of that. And then her next oldest sister, Penny, got engaged. Penny was the last of them who was living at home, and now she is getting married and will be moving out of the house. And so Sammy has to come back to Vancouver. Now, we don't know a lot about Sammy's life in Montreal. We know that things weren't exactly what she had anticipated. She was in a relationship, but we don't know much about it. The relationship is now over, but we don't know why. All we know is that Sammy is now coming back to Vancouver after being gone for 6 years and doesn't quite know how she feels about it. Now, as soon as she arrives, her mother tells her that it's finally time to remove, I think the words she uses are the old man smell from their house. So 10 years ago, Sammy's grandfather, Saedquan Chan, passed away. His stuff has been kept in the house since then, and her mother has finally decided that it is time to get rid of it. So she has built a bonfire in their yard, and they're systematically moving everything from his room downstairs to the yard to burn. And so as soon as Sammy arrives, she is thrown into work to try and help to clear out his room. And through this process, she finds an old box full of his belongings. She finds sketches that look to be of her mother. She finds information on when her grandfather first came to Vancouver. And she decides that she's going to learn a little bit more about him, a little bit more about her father, Pon Man, and a little bit more about her family. From here, we go back to 1913, where we see Saedquan first arrive in Vancouver as an 18-year-old boy. His village raised enough money to send him to Canada with the hopes that he would become successful and in turn be able to send money back not just to his parents, to his eventual wife, but to the village themselves. And so here he is, never having left his small village before. He arrives on a boat in Vancouver and doesn't really know what to expect. But he is determined, he is a hard worker, and he knows what is expected of him. And so he does the work. He puts the time in. He lives a very lonely life, but he does the work. He eventually works his way up to owning his own barbershop. Now, through these years that he spends his time working and getting his barbershop, he goes back to China a handful of times. The first time to get married, and then to have or to conceive each of his children. These are the only times that he goes back to see his family. By the time his son is 15 years old, he has never met him. He has met his daughters once, twice maybe, but he doesn't really know his family. So when at the age of 15, Pon Man is sent to live with him in Canada, the two are basically strangers and very different generations who are struggling to understand each other, to figure out how to communicate. In Saedquan's mind, Pon Man is the luckiest boy in the world to get the opportunity to come to Canada. To Pon Man, he's been ripped from his home. He's been taken away from his mother, and he doesn't know what he's doing. The story bounces back and forth between the present day where we see Sammy's story unfold, to the past, where we see as Said Kwan and Pon Man figure out their life in Canada. We meet Said Kwan's wife, Shu Lin, and she eventually gets the chance to move to Canada as well. We meet Su Sang, who is Pon Man's wife as well, who has been sent for from Hong Kong, and she too is moved to Vancouver. Throughout all of these stories is a lot of trauma. Each of these people has basically been ripped from the life that they knew with a promise of one that's going to be better, that's going to be more than what they expected. And each of these experiences has a significant impact on the people and the adults that they become. We pretty much get to experience the entire story of this family up into the present day from 1913. And it is quite a tragic story. I think that as we go, we get an explanation for why some of the characters are the way that they are, some of the things that they have had to endure that have caused them to become the way that they are, that has kind of led this family to be what it is in the present day. We get Sammy's story a little bit, and I have to admit that I struggled to connect with her story a bit. At the wedding of her sister, she decides to go off and have a relationship, kind of a one-night stand with the bartender. After another encounter with him, she winds up in the hospital, which in the end does work, I think, to bring her and her mother closer together. But it struck me as a little bit out of place in this story, especially because there was not a lot of kind of explanation or backstory to her and to her life. We know, again, like that something happened in Montreal to end the relationship that she was in. We have a little bit of communication from her ex-partner in Montreal, but we don't really know what happened. And so I think that part of the story I felt a little bit lost in. I didn't feel quite as connected to. But it was very interesting kind of reading those past stories and seeing all of these different people. And some reviews say that this book might be autobiographical in a way of Sookfong Lee's life. I don't know, but I think that there are probably many families in Vancouver who can probably look back at their families and see a similar history, at least in kind of the immigrations to Vancouver and to this country, and kind of see those parallels there. It was definitely a side of Vancouver that I'm not as familiar with, and so it was interesting to read that. Kind of same with you, Corene. It's cool to. It was more historical, but to read things like, oh well, that's where I live. Like at one point, Said Kwan walks across from Chinatown to False Creek, and it's like maybe he was at the point where my building is. And so I think that that's one of the cool things about reading something local and reading something of somewhere that you live is just being able to kind of place things in a way that you can't necessarily do in a city or in a area that you're not as familiar with. So that was really cool to kind of see, especially from a historical perspective, kind of where those places are, and to see the development of the city was interesting. And so I think that Chinatown, where it is now, is where it kind of originally was, but to see kind of the way that things have grown around it and to see the perspective of the people who are living there as those changes were being made. And so this family does eventually end up leaving Chinatown and buying a house. It doesn't say exactly where, but kind of buying a house. My guess is East Vancouver, but kind of going back to visit Chinatown. And even they say, Said Kwan goes back at one point in his later years and says that he hardly recognizes kind of what it has become. And so I think that it's interesting to kind of see the progression of that and the development, and not always in a good way sometimes, but not always in a good way. Yeah. So I think the story is heartbreaking. I don't think it's a happy story. There's definitely some points and some characters that I found myself more connected to and sympathizing with and empathizing with. But there's also some things that some of the characters do that are pretty terrible as well. And so I think that it's a sad story. I think that it kind of shows the impact that displacement and that trauma can have on a person and on a family generationally. But it was a really interesting read to kind of see that perspective from something that I have not experienced myself, and being able to kind of immerse myself in that for a little bit. If that sounds like something you'd like, if you like kind of multi-generational stories, kind of historical take, then I would definitely recommend The End of East by Jen Sookfong Lee.
Yeah, I also read The End of East, and yeah, the part with the main character in the modern day, I remember having such a hard time connecting to her. And I definitely think like she's using that as a literary device, as exactly as like as showing us how that trauma kind of like calcifies into a personality. But yeah, I do remember kind of getting by the end of it and just being like, no. No, don't do that. But yes, her follow-up to that was the 2011 The Better Mother. And then she came out with one in 2016, The Conjoined. Again, like I would argue like very Vancouver stories, very kind of like rooted in like a very specific time and place. And then she did some children's books. So she did a couple of children's books, Finding Home, The Journey of Immigrants and Refugees in 2021. And as well as a book that I really want to get my hands on that I just haven't read yet is Superfan, How Pop Culture Broke My Heart, where she talks about like the impact of loving media that sometimes doesn't love her back has, which I think would just be right up my alley. She also did Chinese New Year, a book for kids as well, The Animals Chinese New Year. And she has one coming out soon, which is billed as, and I want to make sure I get this right, domestic horror, which might be perfect for some of our library friends here who are very much into that. It's The Hunger We Pass Down. Which is about a single mother's doppelganger. Oh boy. Which I feel like is going to be a lot. And that is coming out in September, the end of September. So that is The Hunger We Passed Out. Again, going on that theme of like that intergenerational trauma, which I think kind of like infuses through her work. And also talking about like, how do you break that cycle, but kind of putting that within the lens of like single motherhood and a little bit of the supernatural. So I think we'll have to recommend that book to a couple of our book friends here at the library.
Excellent. Thank you, Corene. That's a good kind of overview and delve into some of her other work. And I think both her and Eve Lazarus definitely have quite a collection. If you want to kind of get into both of their works, there's a lot to kind of sink your teeth into, which is great. And yeah, a good representation of BC, I think,
or at least Vancouver.
But I know that because somebody, and I'd have to look again. It was someone. I'm in a Nelson, BC Facebook group. I usually just pay attention to it and laugh. But somebody posted something about Eve Lazarus doing a story that like highlighted something in the Kootenays. So I think that she does do some things not just Vancouver based. I don't know exactly. It may have been one of her cold case books that just had one of them that was from the Kootenays. But so she does branch out to more than just Vancouver. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for listening. It's just a short episode with us today. Just little. We're so happy that you listened today, and maybe we have inspired you to pick up a BC author or a local author. I will use this time to highlight our own local author collection, the White Pines collection. We have so many amazing books and authors, all sorts of different genres, from poetry to nonfiction instructional manuals to mystery to kids books to, oh boy, I'm sure I'm forgetting a ton of stuff, romance. But there's a huge selection within our White Pines collection, graphic novels. So if you want to pick up something local, then I encourage you to come into the library and find the big White Pines sign on the bookshelf and pick up one of those books, as well as try out the Tri-Cities Writers Fest that's happening, as Corene mentioned, at the end of May. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We will see you next time. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.